Chicago, summer 1858. Horses drop dead in the streets. The heat is that brutal. Tar softens under people's boots. The river runs thick and green with algae. The stench is so bad people walk around with wet cloths pressed to their faces. There's one escape most people can actually afford: ice cream. Vendors sell it from carts on every block. Kids eat it barefoot on the curb. Families carry it home wrapped in tin. A few cents of relief from a summer that won't break. Then the sickness starts, a few cases at first. Nobody notices. Within a week, dozens, then hundreds. Same symptoms every time: fever, delirium, internal bleeding. Doctors name it typhoid. By the time it burns out, it's killed over 1,500 people. Investigators trace it block by block, cart by cart, and they find something nobody expected: the ice, cut straight from the city's lakes. The same lakes soaked in raw sewage. Packed in sawdust, hauled to ice cream shops, spooned into bowls, sold by the thousands. But this isn't where the story starts. Long before Chicago, ice cream crossed empires: royal courts in China, spice markets in the Middle East, palace kitchens in Italy, high society salons in Paris. Centuries of history before it ever touched a street cart in Illinois. To understand how it got there, go back further, back to snow, mountain ice, and whoever the first person was who decided to eat it. Ask 10 people who invented ice cream. Most will say the same thing: Italians or the French. There's a story behind that. A 14-year-old girl named Catherine de Medici leaves Florence to marry the future king of France. Legend says she brings Italian chefs with her, and a secret: the recipe for frozen desserts, something the French have never seen before. The story always goes the same way. The recipe stays locked in royal kitchens. Decades pass, it spreads, until frozen desserts become a fixture of aristocratic Europe. Great story, dramatic, specific. One girl, one marriage, one secret, crossing a border and changing food forever. One problem: might not be true. We'll come back to that. Here's what matters right now. This legend gets repeated so often in cookbooks, documentaries, casual conversation, that people accept it without question. It sounds like history: a name, a date, a place. But real history, court records, letters, receipts, tells a different story. One that starts almost 1,000 years earlier. Somewhere nobody would guess. Not France, not Italy, China. 7th century AD, the Tang Dynasty. China's golden age. Explosive growth in art, trade, power. At the center of it, Emperor Taizong, one of the most celebrated rulers in Chinese history. He had a weakness: chilled desserts. The palace kept dedicated ice houses, ice cut from distant mountains in winter, stored deep underground, insulated to survive summer heat. An enormous operation, all for one man's dessert. Court chefs mixed that ice with buffalo milk, flour and camphor, an aromatic substance prized for the cooling sensation it created. Historians still debate exactly what this dish was. It probably didn't look much like modern ice cream, but the core idea is unmistakable: cold, milk, sweet. That's the seed everything else grows from. Here's the part that matters most. This wasn't for sale, not in markets, not at festivals, reserved for the emperor and his closest circle only. The chefs who made it were sworn to secrecy. Breaking that secrecy wasn't a slap on the wrist. It could get you severely punished. So from the very first moment frozen dessert appears in the historical record, it's not just food, it's a symbol: power, wealth, access nobody else had. Only an emperor could eat something this cold, this rare, in a country with zero refrigeration, centuries before the word even existed. And while that secret sat locked inside a Chinese palace, on the other side of the world, a different version of the same idea was about to be born, not behind palace walls, out in the open, in a marketplace. While China's recipes stayed locked behind palace walls, something very different was happening in the Arab world. By the 9th and 10th centuries, vendors were already selling sherbet, snow, fruit juice, sugar, sold openly in the street to anyone who could pay, not royalty, anyone. Getting the snow wasn't easy. Hauled down from distant mountains in insulated containers, moved along established trade routes. Entire supply chains existed just to keep sherbet carts stocked. Vendors became such a common sight that the drink wasn't a luxury anymore, it was an institution. The word itself, sherbet, worked its way into European languages carried along the same trade routes. One of the clearest clues historians have for tracing where this all began. From the Arab world, it kept moving. First stop, Sicily. For centuries, Sicily sat under Arab influence. Arab food culture didn't just visit, it took root. Sherbet evolved into granita, crushed ice, fruit juice, still recognizably Arab in origin, but its own thing now, and it never disappeared, still made today. Same basic principles as 1,000 years ago, but Sicily was never the destination, just a stop. From there, it pushed north into mainland Europe over the following centuries. And this is exactly where the legend usually inserts itself. Catherine de Medici. Italian chefs. A secret crossing into France in 1533. Except historians who specialize in this have looked for evidence and found nothing. No 16th century document mentions it. No court record, no letter. No account of an Italian bride single-handedly introducing frozen dessert to French royalty. The legend doesn't show up in print anywhere until the 20th century, nearly 400 years after it supposedly happened. That's not a small gap. That's the difference between real history and a story invented centuries later, repeated so often it got mistaken for fact. What actually happened is less cinematic. Frozen dessert spread through France and Italy at roughly the same time, the 17th century, driven by trade with the Arab Mediterranean. No dramatic entrance, no secret. No single bride crossing a border and changing everything overnight. But there was one person who took this slow-spreading idea and turned it into something the public couldn't stop talking about. His name was Francesco Procopio dei Coltelli, a Sicilian who understood something nobody else in Europe had figured out yet. Frozen dessert wasn't just a novelty, it was an experience. Present it right, people will pay for it. Procopio opens a cafe in Paris, Café Procope. It's still there today, still open. The oldest continuously running cafe in the entire city. That alone should tell you something. By the end of the 17th century, Café Procope becomes one of the first places anywhere serving frozen dessert regularly. And in a genuinely wide range of flavors, Procopio didn't just scoop it into a bowl, he served it in elegant glass dishes, treated it like theater. Fruit, chocolate, vanilla, a flavor that had only just arrived in Europe through trade with the New World. And the people sitting in that cafe weren't random. Voltaire, Rousseau, Benjamin Franklin, living in Paris at the time. This wasn't a dessert shop, it was where Europe's sharpest minds gathered. Something shifted here. Ice cream stopped being just about taste. Being seen at Café Procope, ordering frozen chocolate in an elegant glass cup, became a signal. It told the room you belonged, educated, wealthy, elite. The cafe functioned exactly like an exclusive club functions today, a room that sorts people by status the second they walk in. Through places like this, ice cream worked its way into the identity of European high society, no longer hidden behind imperial walls the way it was in Tang Dynasty China. Visible now, served in glass, discussed by philosophers, but still, unmistakably, a luxury. And that's where the story hits a wall. Because no matter how elegant the presentation, no matter How many famous names sat in those chairs, old? There was one problem money couldn't solve: ice. Frozen dessert needed a steady supply. In the 17th and 18th centuries, that supply didn't exist most of the year. Abundant in winter, nearly impossible in summer, exactly when demand hit its peak. Even Paris's wealthiest families struggled to keep ice on hand through the warm months. For nearly everyone, ice cream stayed what it always was: an occasional treat, saved for festivals, celebrations, the rare household that could maintain its own ice house year-round. Someone had to solve the ice problem. The person who eventually did wasn't a chef, wasn't a nobleman, wasn't even from Europe. His name was Frederic Tudor. Early 1800s, 22 years old. He had an idea almost everyone around him thought was insane: cut massive blocks of ice from the frozen lakes of New England, pack them in sawdust, load them onto ships, send them to warm climates where ice essentially didn't exist. Starting with Cuba, the Caribbean, people didn't just doubt him, they mocked him. Newspapers ran it as a joke. His own family wouldn't put $1 into it. One Boston publication sarcastically suggested his next venture would be selling bottled air. Tudor went ahead anyway. His first shipment lands in Martinique. Disaster. Most of the ice melts before it even arrives. Nobody had figured out long-distance ice transport yet, including Tudor. The merchants who got what was left didn't know what to do with it. Nobody had ever sold them ice before, so they refused to buy it. Tudor lost almost everything, ended up in debtor's prison. Most people stopped there. Tudor didn't. After his release, he went back to work, tested insulating materials, redesigned his storage facilities from scratch, worked out better packing techniques to cut losses on long voyages, but the technical fix was only half of it. You can't sell people something they've never wanted, so Tudor went straight to merchants and restaurant owners, taught them how to store ice properly, gave away free ice cream just to prove why any of this mattered. Let people feel a cold drink on a brutal day, and let the product sell itself. It worked. By the 1830s, Tudor's company was shipping ice to India, Australia, China, an operation that would have sounded like fiction to the newspapers that mocked him. Frederic Tudor became one of the wealthiest men in Boston. They called him the Ice King. What he built wasn't just a fortune. It was the foundation of an entire global industry, one that turned ice from a rare seasonal luxury into a commodity you could ship anywhere, any time of year. And it was this exact industry that eventually made ice cheap enough to reach street vendors in cities like Chicago, which brings the story right back to where it started. Tudor's industry didn't just make ice cheaper, it made it available everywhere, all year round, to almost anyone. That's exactly what turned ice cream from an occasional treat into a permanent fixture of daily life. But that growth came with a cost nobody accounted for. As demand exploded, competition between ice suppliers got brutal. Companies needed more ice, faster, cheaper than their rivals. Cutting corners became the easy way to get there. Some stopped being selective about where they harvested. Frozen lake or river. Didn't matter what was flowing into it upstream. That's exactly the chain of events that led to Chicago, 1858. The ice cut from the city's lakes wasn't coming from clean mountain sources anymore. It was coming from water sitting downstream of the city's own sewage, the same water that turned the river green, the same stench that sent people into the streets with wet cloths over their faces. Nobody selling that ice meant any harm. Most vendors had no idea what was actually packed into those blocks. Ice was ice, frozen, natural, safe by default. That assumption alone let a public health disaster unfold in plain sight, one dish at a time. Over 1,500 people paid for it with their lives. The epidemic made one thing brutally clear. An industry built on cutting ice straight out of lakes and rivers had a fatal flaw. As cities grew and waterways got dirtier, the system wasn't just inconvenient anymore, it was dangerous. Refrigeration technology was already advancing. The real fix wouldn't come from cutting smarter. It would come from freezing artificially. No lakes, no rivers. But that shift was still years away. In the meantime, ice cream was about to be transformed again, not by an engineer solving a supply chain, by something more personal. A machine that let ordinary families make it at home, without vendors, without parlors, without questionable ice at all. And the person behind it wasn't who anyone would have expected. Her name was Nancy Johnson, 1843. She did something nobody else had managed. She made ice cream, something an ordinary family could actually produce at home. No cafe, no vendor, no royal ice house required. Before Johnson's invention, homemade ice cream was slow, exhausting. You needed ice, salt, a container, and hours of manual stirring just to keep large ice crystals from forming. Even then, you'd end up with something grainy, uneven. Most families just didn't bother. Johnson's design changed that. She patented a hand-cranked ice cream maker, a rotating paddle inside a metal container, sitting inside a larger container packed with ice and salt. The salt was the detail most people would never think to question. Mixing it with ice lowered the freezing point, cooling the mixture faster and more evenly than plain ice ever could. The paddle kept turning the whole time, stopping large ice crystals from forming. That's exactly what gives homemade ice cream that smooth, almost professional texture instead of an icy mess. The result was staggering. What used to take hours now took 20 minutes. For any family with access to ice, a much bigger number now thanks to Tudor's industry, making real ice cream at home went from rare luxury to an ordinary afternoon. This is the part of the story that should have made Nancy Johnson wealthy. It didn't. Shortly after getting her patent, Johnson sold the full rights for $200. William Young bought them and built an entire commercial business around manufacturing ice cream makers based on her design. A business that went on to be genuinely successful, reaching households across the country. Johnson got none of that. No royalties, no ongoing share, nothing beyond that first, modest payment. The woman whose invention reshaped how an entire country made ice cream simply disappears from the record after that sale. Her story isn't unique. Historians point to Johnson as one of many 19th century women inventors who created enormous value for other people, yet saw almost none of it themselves. The legal and social barriers of the time made it nearly impossible for women to profit from their own patents, even when the invention was genuinely transformative. And this one was. Johnson's freezer is what pulled ice cream out of cafes and vendor carts and put it directly into homes, something families could make themselves, not just buy as a rare treat. By the middle of the 19th century, thanks largely to a woman who never profited from her own idea, ice cream stopped being a luxury for the wealthy. It was becoming something else, something that belonged to everyone. And that shift was about to speed up in a way nobody was expecting. By the end of the 19th century, a new kind of gathering place popped up across American cities. The soda fountain, carbonated water, fruit syrup, sometimes ice cream on top. It became a social institution, and especially for young people, want to see and be seen. The soda fountain was where you went, a lot like a modern coffee shop, built as much for socializing as for the drinks. But there was a problem. Sunday, in a lot of American communities, was a day of rest. Certain kinds of indulgence were frowned on, in some cities outright illegal, including selling soda water. Soda fountain owners weren't about to close one day a week over a technicality, so they found a workaround. On Sundays, they'd skip the carbonation and serve plain ice cream with flavored syrup instead. Technically not a soda, technically not breaking any law. Over time, this workaround got its own name, the Sundae, spelled at first exactly like the day it was invented to dodge. The widely repeated explanation for the spelling change, Sunday, to Sundae is that it avoided naming a dessert directly after a religious day. Historians still argue over whether that's the whole story, but the basic outline holds. A Sundae loophole gave birth to a new dessert. Pinning down exactly where it started is its own mess. One of the earliest documented sales traces back to 1892, Ithaca, New York. But Ithaca isn't the only city claiming the title. Several others have made their own case. None of it's ever been settled. Not unusual, by the way. A lot of famous foods have competing origin claims, usually just enough evidence on each side to keep the argument alive, never enough to end it. What isn't up for debate? What happened next? The Sundae caught on fast. It stopped being a workaround and became a dessert in its own right. Popular enough that soda fountains kept selling it even on days when soda was perfectly legal. Today, the chocolate sundae, whipped cream, cherry on top, is instantly recognizable almost anywhere on Earth, and it's worth sitting with how it actually came to exist. Not a chef's flash of genius in a kitchen somewhere, a handful of business owners dodging a religious law, one flavored topping at a time. Sometimes the most iconic foods aren't invented on purpose, they're improvised, a workaround that happened to taste good enough to outlive the rule it was built to dodge. And a few years later, another completely accidental invention was about to change how people ate ice cream forever. This time not because of a law, because someone ran out of cups. 1904, the World's Fair, St. Louis, 7 months, 20 million people passed through the gates. An almost unimaginable number for the time. Ice cream vendors are working non-stop. In that heat, with crowds that size, demand never lets up. Then, at the busiest possible moment, disaster strikes in the smallest possible way. A vendor runs out of paper cups, no way to serve the line waiting in front of him. According to the most widely told version, a neighboring vendor steps in. Ernest Hamwi, a Syrian immigrant selling thin, waffle-like pastries from the stall next door. He watches the ice cream vendor scramble, rolls one of his waffles into a cone, hands it over as a makeshift cup, improvised on the spot out of whatever was sitting right there. It works, better than works. Visitors love it. Word spreads across the fairgrounds fast. Within days, the rolled waffle cone isn't a fix anymore. It's a sensation people are specifically seeking out. Was Hamwi really first? Still an open question. Several other vendors at the same fair later claimed credit, each with a strikingly similar story. Historians have never settled who did it first, or whether it happened in one spontaneous moment at all. What's not up for debate is the effect. The 1904 World's Fair is the moment the waffle cone stops being a regional curiosity and becomes one of the most recognizable ways to eat ice cream on Earth. So common today, it barely registers as an invention. It's just how ice cream comes. Notice what's converging here. Waffle-making traditions rooted in the Middle East. Centuries of European ice cream craft stretching back to Procope's Paris Café. An American World's Fair platform big enough to put a new idea in front of 20 million people at once. 3 separate threads of history, colliding in a single stall, on one hot afternoon, because someone ran out of cups. While ice cream was being reshaped on a fairground in Missouri, something else was happening on the other side of the Atlantic. Nothing to do with how it was served, everything to do with what it actually was. Late 1940s, a team of British researchers in the food industry sets out to solve an unglamorous problem. How to make ice cream production faster, cheaper, more efficient, without losing quality. Not a bakery, not a dessert shop, a lab. Chemists studying exactly how manufacturing changes affect the finished product. Texture, stability, how well it survives storage and transport. The kind of work that never makes it into any story about ice cream, because it isn't dramatic, it's chemistry. One researcher on that team, a young chemist named Margaret Roberts. If that name means nothing yet, here's the twist. Margaret Roberts would later become Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, one of the most consequential political figures of the 20th century. Before Downing Street, before any of it, she spent part of her early career helping figure out how to make ice cream cheaper to manufacture. Sounds too strange to be true. It's well documented. The solution her team landed on was deceptively simple. Increase the air, fold it into the mixture during churning. More air meant manufacturers could stretch the same raw ingredients into a bigger batch. No extra milk, no extra sugar, no extra fat. But it wasn't just about stretching ingredients. The air changed the texture too. Softer, more stable, better able to survive shipping without breaking down. For manufacturers at scale, that combination was enormous. This is the technology behind soft serve, the kind swirled out of a machine at a fast food counter in seconds, not scooped from a tub. Less milk fat than traditional ice cream, a lot more air. That's exactly why it's light, and exactly why it stays soft at temperatures that would leave regular ice cream rock hard. Every leap before this one was about access. Getting ice to more people, more places, more of the year. This one was different. It was about cost. Cheaper to produce meant cheaper to sell, which meant it reached people who never could have afforded it before. From soft serve machines to street carts in countries with zero ice cream tradition. But this piece of food, sign letter, worked out by a chemist who'd go on to run a country, helped push ice cream the rest of the way. From luxury to something sold on nearly every corner in nearly every country for almost nothing. And while private companies in the West kept racing to make it cheaper, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, a different country was about to turn ice cream into something else entirely, not just a product, a symbol of an entire political system. While ice cream in the West evolved through companies competing for market share, the Soviet Union took a different path. A government ministry decided what ice cream should be, not a corporation. 1930s. A Soviet official named Anastas Mikoyan travels to the United States, People's Commissar for the food industry. His job, study large-scale American food, manufacturing up close. He tours factories, studies machinery the Soviet Union had nothing comparable to. He goes home and builds an entire ice cream industry from what he learned. New factories, rapid expansion. For the first time, ice cream becomes accessible to ordinary Soviet citizens, not just a treat for the privileged. But this wasn't market-driven, it was planned, down to the smallest detail. Strict state standards dictated ingredients and quality. The same standards, every factory, no exceptions. Classic Soviet ice cream, plombier, used real dairy fat, not the cheap vegetable substitutes catching on elsewhere. That single choice earned it a reputation as genuinely premium. Because the standards were uniform nationwide, plombier tasted the same everywhere. Moscow, thousands of miles away, nearly identical. That consistency became part of its identity. Foreign visitors touring the USSR during the Cold War kept mentioning it in their memoirs, not as a footnote, as something that actually stood out. In a country defined internationally by scarcity, ice cream became an unexpected point of quiet pride. One detail observers noticed again and again. Soviet citizens ate ice cream year-round, not just summer, freezing streets, dead of winter without hesitation, not a warm weather indulgence, just part of daily life. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. The market shifted overnight. New manufacturers flooded in. Cheaper recipes, vegetable fats instead of dairy. For people who grew up on the original, that wasn't just a taste change, got tangled up with something bigger. classic Soviet ice cream became a symbol of an entire vanished era. People still argue whether Soviet-era plombier was genuinely better, or whether that's just nostalgia talking. No definitive answer, driven more by memory than by any real measure of quality. But that argument reveals something bigger than ice cream. How a simple frozen dessert got woven so deeply into national identity that losing it felt, to an entire generation, like losing a piece of the world they grew up in. Today, the global ice cream market is worth roughly $200 billion a year. That's in the same range as the entire economic output of some countries. What started as a secret recipe guarded inside a Chinese palace is now an industry big enough to rival a nation's GDP. The biggest per capita consumers might surprise you. The United States, Australia, New Zealand, places where ice cream isn't a treat anymore. It's a baseline expectation. But the biggest shift happened somewhere else. China. The same country where this story technically began over 1,000 years ago, inside an emperor's private ice house. Now ranks first in the world in total consumption. A few decades ago, China's industrial ice cream market was small. Today, it's the largest on Earth, still growing. There's something almost poetic in that. The country where frozen dessert was once so exclusive only an emperor could taste it, is now the single biggest ice cream market on the planet. The whole arc closed in one sentence. At the industrial level, the scale is staggering. The world's largest manufacturers produce billions of servings a year, distributed across dozens of countries, sometimes hundreds. Ice cream isn't just popular, it's one of the most genuinely globalized foods that exist. Japan gave the world mochi filled with ice cream. Virtually unknown outside the country not long ago, now sought out internationally. Italy's gelato, often assumed to be some ancient, unbroken tradition, actually only took its modern form in the 20th century. Younger than most people think, still one of Italy's most iconic exports. And it hasn't stopped evolving. Lactose-free and plant-based ice creams, coconut, oat, almond, went from niche to one of the fastest-growing segments in the entire industry. Manufacturers are flash freezing with liquid nitrogen, building sugar-free formulas, adding probiotics, still chasing the same question that's driven this whole story from the start. How do you make something people already love even more appealing, more accessible, more available? Whether ice cream ever becomes part of a genuinely healthy diet, still an open question. But 3,000 years of history makes one thing clear. Ice cream doesn't stay still. It adapts to whatever the era demands. Imperial secrecy, aristocratic spectacle, industrial efficiency, wartime nostalgia, modern wellness culture. It always finds its way forward. Trace the whole journey back, start to finish. It stops looking like the story of a dessert. It starts looking like a story about who gets to have things and how that keeps shifting century after century without anyone ever deciding to change it on purpose. It starts with snow. Just snow carried down a mountain by hand because someone, at some point nobody recorded, decided cold felt good in the mouth. That's the seed for everything. Then it becomes something guarded. Locked inside a Chinese emperor's private ice house. Chefs sworn to secrecy. Punishable to reveal. Cold milk, sugar. Simple enough to belong to anyone. Kept from almost everyone. Then it slips loose. Sold in the open air of Arab marketplaces to whoever has a coin. It crosses the water to Sicily. Becomes something new. Drifts north into Europe. Not through one dramatic royal marriage, the way the legend insists. Slowly, unglamorously, the way real history actually moves. It becomes theatre in a Paris cafe. Served in glass to philosophers and future presidents, it hits a wall, the same wall it always hits, ice. Never enough, not when you need it most. It takes a mocked, broke, imprisoned young man from Boston to break that wall down. Not with a discovery, with refusal to accept no. It becomes something a family can make in their own kitchen in 20 minutes, thanks to a woman who solved the problem and watched everyone else profit from it. It becomes a loophole around a religious law invented by soda fountain owners trying to keep selling something on a Sunday. It becomes a rolled-up waffle at a fairground in St. Louis, improvised in seconds because a vendor ran out of cups. It becomes air mixed in by a chemist in a British lab who'd go on to run a country. It becomes a symbol of an entire political system, remembered decades later by people mourning a version of their own childhood. And somewhere in the middle of all that, quietly, almost as an afterthought, it becomes dangerous. It kills more than 1,500 people in a single Chicago summer. Not because anyone meant harm, because the same forces that made it accessible to everyone also made it possible to cut corners nobody thought to check. Almost nobody connects that when they eat it today. The ease of it, cheap, everywhere, a kid buying it from a cart with pocket change, isn't the natural state of ice cream. It's the end result of 3,000 years of secrecy, broken open over and over by people who weren't royalty, weren't chemists by trade, weren't even trying to make history. A businessman who wouldn't quit, a woman who was never paid what she was owed, a vendor who improvised under pressure, a scientist who became a prime minister. None of them set out to democratize a dessert. They were just solving the problem in front of them, and because they did, something that once required an emperor's permission now costs about what a coin can buy at a corner cart in almost any city on earth. From a mountain of snow to a paper cup in Chicago, nobody built that on purpose. It just happened, one solved problem at a time.